or maybe it's a collection of letters or whatever. What's going to make that valuable for others will be exactly how idiosyncratically individual you have been able to be with the language, putting it forward in a sense, in ways that has never quite been used before. And that's what makes a Derek Walcott poem a Derek Walcott poem. That's what makes a Seamus Heaney poem a Seamus Heaney poem. Because they have put their stamp on it, on the language, in ways that no one else ever has.
Just a quick update. I just opened the webinar and attendees are already coming in.
Yeah.
If we can quickly check Archana ma'am's audio and video.
Yeah, so she'll introduce. George, Peter will introduce the event. This time we are. I didn't have time to talk about how poetry works in a regular format. We work a lot with schools and colleges when the actual festival happens. So this is one of the colleges we regularly collaborate during the festival. So their students have signed in to attend today. So she's Professor Archana Sardana. So she'll be introducing you. And then you can read your poems. Then Pete, you can go in for the Q&A and we can end it by your poem if we have time. So we can go up to 8. In case of any time issues, Peter or I will text you in the chat. But the question answers will come in Q&A, but Peter will handle that. So generally by 7:05 we open. Now I think the audience are already in. They can listen to us talk. But yeah, so.
Yeah, they've been listening to the backstage instructions. Terrible, terrible.
But that's half the fun, knowing how the show is run. So.
Yeah, well, how long have you been putting together these interviews?
So actually from October, September end was the first poetry reading by K.K. Darwala. But the festival we started hosting since 2007.
Oh, wow. All right.
So generally we have 25 poets from India and abroad. So each get 4 to 5 readings. It can be a cafeteria, college, gymnasium, bank, you name it, we have done in every imaginable space. Sari shops, metro trains, we have done stations, we have done in every single thing, but we work closely with around 10 colleges, and we ensure that all the poets gets to read in for a huge, like generally in a college it will be around 80 to 100 audience, but the general reading will be 20, but the other readings are very intimate, 10 to 50, but it's a mix of both a college audience and general public. So we ensure that everyone gets to read in at least 4 to 5 venues. And we also host performances on poetry. We show film screenings. We have done music concerts on poetry. We've done, you name it, we've done everything around poetry. After the pandemic, we didn't do anything. But when we discussed with Peter, and Peter came on board, and we decided, okay, we'll take this challenge upon trying in Zoom. So far, we've got very good response, and except for 1 or 2 times, the technicals never failed us. So fingers crossed. We are, and hoping once things are better, you can come to India and be part of our festival.
I would love to do that. And I have to say it's a great honor for me to be invited to take part in today's session. It really means a lot to me. And I thank you profoundly for your interest in my work and having me appear here. A really, really beautiful and important and memorable for me to be able to do this. And wow, so and you're based in Chennai? Is that how you pronounce
Yes.
it? Chennai? Wow. And that's I know of Chennai because it's it has a particular history, doesn't it?
So we were the first state to be colonized. So the East India Company landed in Chennai before going to Kolkata and then to Delhi, but we are the first.
Okay.
So all the first in India, like the medical college, the presidency college, the secretariat, everything started. We are the first. So we have a lot of colonial buildings. So they call it Indo-Saracenic architecture. So which is very particular to Chennai and West Bengal. So that's the connection, I can say.
Wow.
And it is a very, we are a UNESCO heritage city, and every time in December we have music and classical dance performances in December throughout Chennai. So we coincided this festival to happen during that time. So poetry as an art form can also be heard alongside. So that was the whole idea. I don't know whether he joined, but yeah, my trustee is still not signed in yet. But yeah, it is his vision. It's one man vision's mission and dream. So, and we have done 10 years. So I can share all the details later. I think it's now up to Peter, you and Archana. I can start, Peter.
I'm going
Just
to.
one more thing, George, is that when we start, I'll be on camera until you come on. Professor Archana will be introducing you. When you're reading, we'll all have our cameras off, so full attention is on you. I'll come back with my video on when we start the Q&A.
Okay. Should I read just straight through, or should I read and then stop and ask for a question and then go on?
No, whatever you feel like, but you could probably just read through and save one poem for the end.
I will. Okay.
We can finish off with your voice, the poet's voice. So it works well. So we can go
we
back.
always like to do that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a fair amount of people in the audience already. So should we start up, Mira?
Yes, Peter. Yeah.
Have a good evening, Peter.
Okay. Yeah. Good evening, folks, and thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. I must remember that we have an international audience today, so whatever time of day it is for you, welcome. Thank you for joining us. What is, I think, Saturday for pretty much everyone who's logged in now. It's lovely to have you here. Let me just start off by telling you a little bit about the Prakriti Foundation. The Prakriti Foundation is an arts and culture NGO headquartered in Chennai in Tamil Nadu, which is in the south of India. Traditionally, so Prakriti Foundation does a number of different events through the year, annual festivals, regular events through the year, etc. Do look up the website at Prakriti Foundation's website. We'll put the links in a bit later. Poetry with Prakriti is one of the many festivals that they run. Traditionally, Poetry with Prakriti has happened in Chennai in the month of December at around the same time as the famous music festival, for which Carnatic music aficionados from all over the world with of Indian ancestry or otherwise come in to catch the very best of music. And the idea here was to also to showcase to all these people from the city about it, as lovely as that festival is, it is not the only aspect of Chennai's culture that is worth celebrating. So, and it's also a pleasant time of the year in Madras as well. I say Madras, I spent a part of my childhood there when it was called Madras, so I do slip into that word now and then. My apologies to anybody who much prefers the word Chennai. But yes, so Poetry with Prakriti has happened And it's unlike most festivals, it's atypical venues. You would have your libraries and your bookshops and your art galleries, but you'd also have poems in the metro, on a bus, in a shopping center, in a restaurant, and things like that. At the time that I read Poetry with Prakriti, which was around 2010 or 2009, I can't remember which, but I read to primary school students, and I read to secondary and primary school students, to in an art gallery, in an artist colony, the works, the differences. So the idea is to bring poetry here, and it's poets from all over India, and whenever budgets permit it or their own travel schedules permit it, poets from other parts of the world as well. So that is Poetry with Prakriti. Last year, the team decided that it would be unwise to even try and plan a festival for, live in Chennai. And in October itself, it started off with a series that's Poetry with Prakriti online. So the first 3 Saturdays of every month, each the time is a different poet, reading, a little bit of conversation with the moderator, and then open to questions from the audience. Our format has stayed roughly the same. We will be turning it over, in other words, to you folks for questions. We're going to ask you that if you have questions, please use the Q&A box, not the chat. You're free, everyone, to chat in the chat box whenever you like, to say things to each other, to express your appreciation for our poet today. But if you have a specific question, Mr. Clarke, do please put it in the Q&A box only. I'm now going to hand this over to Professor Archana from Anadarsh University, who will be introducing our guest today.
Hello, and good evening, everyone. It's such a privilege to introduce our poet for this session. Listening to a contemporary poet laureate is a great honor and a rare privilege. We are extremely grateful to Prakriti Foundation for bringing to us the pure delight of listening to the hugely talented and well-acknowledged poet, George Elliott Clarke, the 4th Poet Laureate of Toronto and the 7th Canadian Poet Laureate 2016-17. George Elliott Clarke is the first and foremost poet. He's a poet and then a prose writer, novelist, playwright, and opera composer. His trajectory as a writer includes of art, poetry, and culture. Born in Windsor, Nova Scotia, Clarke is a pioneering scholar of African Canadian literature. A professor at the University of Toronto, he also taught at Duke and Harvard. Recognitions and awards include the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Fellows Prize, the Governor General's Award for Poetry, the Nazim Gold Award for Poetry, the Dartmouth Book Award for Fiction, the Eric Hoffer Book Award for Poetry, and the Dr. Martin Luther King Achievement Awards. 8 honorary doctorates, plus appointments to the Order of Nova Scotia and the Order of Canada. Clarke coined the term Africadian to identify the Black culture of Atlantic Canada. The term is used as a title, Africadian Atlantic, Essays on George Elliott Clarke, a collection of 14 academic essays on Clarke's literary achievements. To quote the poet himself, is akin to dissonance in jazz and perhaps just as enjoyable. It can discern the beat, close quote. We look forward to discerning beat today and hope this session will bring us the much needed respite and relief in these hard times. Thank you. And I'm handing over the session now to Clarke, the poet of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Very nice to have you as and also, thank you for the support of your college as you have stepped forward so many times to be with us here today, for bringing in your students as well. And yes, without further ado, here's George.
Peter, thank you so much. I also want to say thank you greatly to Prakriti Foundation for this session and other sessions, of course. And I'm really happy also to be following in the footsteps, so to speak, of my Canadian compatriot, poet Aisha Chatterjee, who appeared for Prakriti just 2 weeks ago. And I also want to thank Professor Achana for that beautiful introduction of myself. And I'll also say quickly what an incredible honor it is for me to be part of this session and to be helping to talk about and enjoy and celebrate poetry in the midst of this very troubled time for all of us. I'm speaking to you, good morning, by the way, and good evening from Toronto, Canada. We are ourselves right now in this Canada's largest city, going through a major spike in COVID infections. So it's very much on our minds as it is on your minds in India. Right now. And of course, we are all hopeful that we will get through this as soon as we have enough folks vaccinated. At the same time, mentally and spiritually, we have poetry and we have art and we have music and we have literature in general and nature to help us focus spiritually and to maintain optimism and good cheer as much as possible as we get through this global emergency. So I'm going to begin by reading from an earlier poem of mine. It's called Look Homeward, Exile. And I have to confess that it's a very bizarre title because I wrote the poem on my first trip to Europe when I was 25 years old in 1985. I'd never been away from North America and even Canada. I hadn't even really been away from Canada very much before I made that trip to Europe in 1985. So I was sitting in a laundromat in Amsterdam and I was having a raspberry milkshake from McDonald's. And I was watching my clothes spin around in the dryer. And I started to think about my home community in Nova Scotia, Black community, which goes back 200 years. And I still own land there, a little piece of land. I still own it. And it goes back to my slave ancestors. So I feel very, very powerfully connected to Nova Scotia because of that little piece of property and my family history. So the curious thing is that I'm imagining that I'm in exile from Nova Scotia, being in Amsterdam and thinking about my childhood and my connection to this little piece of Black Nova Scotia. So here it is, Look Homeward, Exile. I can still see that soil crimsoned by butchered hog and imbrued with rye, lie, and homely spirituals everybody must know. Still dream of folks who broke or cracked like shale. Pushkin, who twisted his hands in boxing. Morocco, who ran girls like dogs and got stabbed. Lavinia, her teeth decayed to black stumps. Her love-making still in demand, spitting black phlegm. Her pension after 20 towns. And Tooth, suckled on anger that no Baptist church could contain, who let wrinkled Ely seed her moist womb when she was just 13. and the tyrant sun that reared from barbed wire spewed flame that charred the idiot crops to depression and hurt my granddaddy to bottle after bottle of sweet death, his dreams beaten to one tremendous pulp until his heart seized, choked, his love gave out. But beauty survived, secreted in freight trains, snorting in their pins, in babes whose faces were coal black mirrors, and strange strummers who plucked Ghanaian banjos, hummed blind blues precise, ornate, rich needlepoint, in sermons scorched with sulfur and brimstone, and in my love's dark orient skin that smelt like orange peels and tasted like rum. Good God, I remember my creator in the old ways. I sit in taverns and stare at my fists. I knead earth into bread, spell water into wine. Still nothing warms my wintry exile, neither prayers nor fine love, neither votes nor hard drink, for nothing heals those saints felled in green beds, whose loves are smashed by just one word or glance, or pain, a screw jammed in thick, straining wood. So as the poem may indicate, Black Nova Scotia, African Nova Scotia, Africadia, as I also call it, is a community that has emerged from slavery, the protests against slavery, through racism and segregation and poverty and illiteracy. And the poem touches on those realities of my home community and my response to this history of endurance and pain and attempting to find love and beauty despite all of the oppression that we have experienced. But I want to move to a slightly lighter piece. Well, actually, I shouldn't say it's lighter because it isn't really. It's a piece I've written in the voice of a young woman whose name is Shelley. And Shelley is responding in this poem called The Wisdom of Shelley. She's responding to a young man whose name is X, who's trying to court her. He's a little bit older than her. He's got some university education and he's trying to court her. But she's very suspicious about all his fine words and all his great vocabulary and oratory and rhetoric. And that's what this poem is about. So the poem is called The Wisdom of Shelley, and I will try to read it in Shelley's voice. You come down after 5 winters, X, bristling with roses and words, 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 brazen as brass. Like a late blizzard, you bust in our door, talking April and snow and rain, littering the table with poems, as if we could trust them. I can't. I heard Pa tell Ma how much and much he loved, loved, loved her. And I saw his fist fall so gracefully against her cheek, she swooned. Roses got thorns, and words do lie. I've seen love die. So that's The Wisdom of Shelley. The next poem I'd like to read is actually indebted to the Tang Dynasty Chinese poet Li Po, whose name in Japanese is Raihaku. And I mentioned the Japanese name for Li Po, Raihaku, because the American poet Ezra Pound took Li Po / Raihaku's original poem, which in Chinese is called The Song of Chen Kan. And Pound took the Japanese translation of the Chinese original poem and made a new poem out of it, English poem, translation more or less. I call them translations, Trance, translations, as opposed to translations. Because what Pound does is transform the original Chinese/Japanese into what he preferred to think of as a more modern idiom of English. So he transformed the Song of Chang Can into a poem that he titled The River Merchant's Wife, a Letter. When I first read that poem, I was 16 in 1976. I thought I was hearing Mississippi blues out of this Chinese poem transformed by the American Cracker Barrel crazy poet Ezra Pound. And I loved it. And so I always knew I would write my own version of it. So what I'm about to read is called The River Pilgrim, a Letter. And in my version of the original poem by Li Po, Ryaku, the speaker is male, not female, and is yearning to see a woman that he hasn't seen for several years. So it's the gender reverse of The River Merchant's Wife, a Letter. So here it is, The River Pilgrim, a Letter, and I express my unfettered debts, plural, to Pound and to Li Po. At 18, I thought the Sisebou wept. 5 years younger, you were lush, beautiful mystery, your limbs, scrolls of deep water. Before your home, lost in roses, I swooned, drunken in the village of Wyla Falls, and brought you apple blossoms you refused, wanting Hank Snow, wood smoke blues, and dried smelts, wanting some mill jerks, dumb, unlettered love. That May, freights chimed xylophone tracks that rang to Marielle. I scribbled postcard odes, painted Le Fleuve Saint Laurent comme le Seine, sad watercolors for Negro exiles in France, and dreamt Paris white with lepers, soft cripples who finger ponds under elms, drink blurry into young debauchery, their glasses clear with Cointreau, rain, and tears. You hung the moon backwards, crooned crooked poems that no voice could straighten, not even O, who stroked guitars because he was going to die with a bullet through his stomach. Innocent, you curled among notes, petals that scaled glissando from windows agape and remained in Southwest Nova Scotia, while I drifted sad and tired in the east. I have been gone 4 springs. This April, pale apple blossoms blizzard, the garden flutes, E flats of lilacs, G sharps of lilies. Too many years are past the marble and pale flowers of Paris, past the broken cubist guitars of Earl. Shelley, I am coming down through the narrows of the Sisebou River. I will write beforehand. Please come out to meet me as far as Gilbert's Cove. I do believe that there is always politics in everything, even though many of us prefer to think that it's really always a totally separate thing. And when it comes to doing any kind of art, politics is something we should avoid because it might detract from the art. And in some cases, and sometimes it does detract from the art, absolutely. But I tend to believe that it's always present anyway. Maybe not directly present, but it's there. It's there in the margins. It's there in the pressures on the writer himself, herself, themselves, about whatever it is they are responding to, even if it's a love poem or an elegy or a nature poem. There are still elements of the social, political, and economic worlds impinging on the consciousness and the imagination of the writer or the poet. But this next poem I want to read is from a collection of poetry which is deliberately political, deliberately. And it's my attempt to think through the histories of slavery and abolition, anti-slavery, of course, emancipation, escape from slavery, but also colonialism. And Canada, like India, has been a colonized nation and colonized by two European powers directly, the English, of course, and the French. And we still carry that colonial heritage, although I will say that most Canadians don't recognize that we still have a colonial heritage. Indigenous Canadians certainly do, because Indigenous Canadians still face the apparatus, the colonial apparatus of our governments and so on, federal, national, and colonial, provincial rather, excuse me. So this next poem is a reflection on colonialism as it has affected India. And I was thinking about the moment of independence for India and Pakistan simultaneously in this poem, which I call Passages to India, of course, thinking of E.M. Forster's novel from the 1930s, I believe, if I remember properly. So, but this is Passages to India, 1947. And I hope I don't sound too irreverent about this history, but I am trying to come at it in some ways playfully, even though it's also a very difficult history. So I just want to say that up front, so to speak. So here it is. Rudyard Kipling was a skin-flint poet with a skinny booklet of tinny schoolboy rhymes, including scrawny haiku scratched by a scraggly hand, but also laid open sonnets in long gone volumes, besotted by opium, slurring anthems, paeans to imperial power at soothing narcotizing volumes that preached to Winston Churchill the necessity of keeping Britain great by keeping India a brown waste, W-A-S-T-E, white, Anglo-Saxon, terrorized, exploited province. The Brits were as fickle as gods out of the abominable Vatican, that's Whitehall. The tweedy directors of finances in reedy continents, finding relevance in shrimps cut down to size, headless, tailless, plus unfailing gin and cucumber and quinine cocktails to spritz up every capital enterprise, and were wantons in their walled off cantons adjacent to Indian urbanity, from whom they gleaned rice pudding and polo, and the poetry of the monsoon rains, rhythmically polishing, if also patiently corroding, stolid but paralyzed marble statues. Mahatma Gandhi was unusual, unmanly, undulant, wiry, a wayfarer seeming, staff-wielding, expert interferer, expert at the Kodewample, i.e. moving purposefully toward a vague destination, albeit utopia. Maybe he faked the appearance of being perpetually peripheral, but he was not the sovereign gangster. No, that wanted poster suits the boss, his grim, dour demeanor, who ensured Kipling's white man's burden got borne by African porters and Indian servants through all his industriously sooty possessions, land grabs, whose imperial map showed crimson splotches wherever brown and black people could be raw materials, whose Union Jack sun rays that, unlike the Japanese empire's equally dagger-shaped beams, injected Christ and commerce into jungle, forest, desert, and ice cap, and who demanded rubies big as eggs, elephant testicles which distilled and drunk could keep an eminence grise erect for joyous hours, C.F. Yeats, plus all the ginger, indigo, pepper, cinnamon, silk, sugar, cotton, rubber, ink, and tiger skins that could be toted, shipped, barged, and dumped all on Thames docks at a healthy, if unholy, 200% interest, contra naturam, saith Pound, all profits to be paid out in gold bullion only, quite, so that the pirate could launder gold shower himself into a prime ministership, if never princehood, while his sons could aspire to be civil servants, simple serpents, soldier clerks with India ink indelible plus indefatigable erasers, whose trunks were fashioned from elephant trunks, and their mates were debonair memsahibs, journeyed to India to police their men's eyes and loins, preserve them from the pure persuasion of all that multitudinous and mutinous pulchritude. Because Gandhi said "niet" to white supremacy in South Africa, freedom, that juggernaut, jaunted eastward, due, overdue self, jolting two and more hemispheres. Though Churchill denies the Indies and thinks Gandhi looks as elegant in his robes as sloughed skin. Jawaharlal Nehru had been politic, maybe a playboy, browsing a tumult of soggy bottom ladies, while Louis Mountbatten had warred, secondly for Burma, through steady summers against Japs and malaria, a bunch of sickening rah-rah Yahoo campaigns, including the Canuck sacrificial Dieppe raid he screwed up. But now he'd shudder the Raj via enlisting Rhodes scholars, formerly drunk and scuzzy in beleaguered Rhodos, but with Vicereine Edwina, the pill-popping poupée, aiding his liberation of 400 million human beings thanks to allegedly trilateral pillow talk. No one knows whether Edwina's white lace gloved hand gripped a whip in the Viceroy's bedroom, or whether Nehru was a dirty mentor in love play, or whether her quinine tonic breath pelted and petted the pundit's perfect no pitfall face, or whether documented quantities of touching flaunted actual unquantifiable passions, or whether their coitus, if any, purred not like a Catholic mass, but roared like elephants intercoursing with lions, or whether Nehru groused as he rode Edwina's icy crack, or whether sheets wrinkled where they wrangled, her lust rankling him as their ankles grazed, bounced. And I think I have probably recited more than my 20 minutes. So I'll stop here and ask if there are any questions that I might be able to try to answer.
George, thank you for that. That was powerful. I mean, I would have liked to have been in the middle of a room with people all around me listening to this, and I'm sure you would have heard stomping feet and clapping hands, but thank you. That was powerful. We will come to the audience, and I'm going to remind you folks in the audience, if you have questions for George, please do put them in the Q&A box. As moderator, I have the prerogative and the privilege of monopolizing the conversation for a few minutes until we do that. So let me take advantage of that. George, could we perhaps step back a little bit and understand from you your own journey in poetry? When did you first come across this creature, poetry? Who were the poets that made you want to be a poet? And let me tack on one more to that. When did you give yourself permission to call yourself a poet?
Peter, those are amazing questions, and I will try to answer them as succinctly as I can, because you know, and all poets know, that we come to poetry through many different, sometimes very twisting and tortuous paths to get to what I like to think of as the palace of poetry. It's up there, it's over there, we can see it, but we get there through very circuitous routes, each of us differently. I don't think there are many who just walk directly into the palace of poetry, and there they are. So for me, that journey really begins really when I'm 15 years old. I'm a teenager. I just finished grade 9. I'm about to go into high school, and I'm worried about if I'm going to be popular or not. And I had a real reason to worry about that because I couldn't play basketball as a young black man. That was a definite curse. I could not play basketball. I couldn't do football. I couldn't skate, so I wasn't going to be a hockey player. And also as a black man, another terrible stroke against me is I can't sing, or I was told I could not sing, and I couldn't dance, and I couldn't play any musical instruments. So I thought, what am I going to do when I get to high school to get some attention? So I thought, I know what, I'll write songs. I'll be a songwriter. And that way I can get a little bit of attention, a little bit of acclaim. And so I started, the day I graduated from grade 9, junior high school, I started to write 4 songs every day. I didn't have music for the most part. Sometimes I had a tune, but generally I would just write lyrics, what I consider could be potentially song lyrics. And so I was influenced by, the people who influenced me were Elton John's songwriter, Bernie Taupin, Lennon and McCartney, the blues singers of America, and their great raunchy lyrics, and so on. Also Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, a whole series of singer-songwriters who were really popular in the 60s and 70s. And I gravitated towards them. As I started to study their songwriting techniques, I kept coming across the argument that in order to be a really good songwriter, you had to be a poet. You had to be a poet first. So after reading this message several times, I thought, well, you know, maybe I should, if I'm going to be a songwriter, maybe I should try to be a poet first, and then I'll write better songs. So it took me a year. So by the time I was 16, and I encountered Pound's River Merchant's Wife, Poundley Poe, River Merchant's Wife, a letter. That poem convinced me at age 16 that I really should be a poet if I was going to be a songwriter. And so then I switched over from writing 4 songs a day, I wrote 4 poems a day. And the difference between them was very simple. A song rhymed and a poem didn't. That's my understanding at the time, was that if you're writing poetry, it's free verse. And if you're writing a song, of course it's going to rhyme. So that was my division. But once I adopted the idea that I should become a poet, I started reading lots of different kinds of poetry. Black American poetry, because it was closest to my reality. You know, as a Canadian, yes, I read Margaret Atwood. Nothing against Margaret. You know, she's fine, she's great, she's excellent, world class. But Margaret Atwood could not talk about police brutality. Margaret Atwood could not talk about the poverty in my community and the oppression of my community. If I wanted a great poem about feminism or nature, and Canadian nationalism, I could certainly read Margaret, and I did read Margaret, and she educated me in those areas. But if I wanted to read about struggle against oppression, I had to go to African American poets. I had to read Leroy Jones. I had to read Gwendolyn Brooks. I had to read again Baraka, Leroy Jones, Robert Hayden, a whole galaxy of Black poets that most Canadians had never encountered. Right. So I grew up reading, as a poet, Canadian poets, white Canadian poets, and Black American poets. But then I also branched out to read, in translation, the French poets, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Chinese poets, again, Li Po, Wang Wei, etc. And still I was reading Bob Dylan as a writer, still reading him, and Jewish poets, Arab poets, South American, Caribbean poets, from the Portuguese, from the Dutch, from the French and Spanish, and also Indian poetry, the great love poetry, especially in translation, of course. And so that really began to fill in my poetry universe. I've taken a long time to answer just one question, but I will say one last thing about this. I gave myself permission to call myself a poet when I wrote a poem about my parents' breakup, split, eventual divorce. But they had for 2 years, when I was between the ages of 12 and 14, my parents' marriage came apart violently, and very disturbingly for myself as a teen. And I wrote a poem about it in my early 20s, and I shared the poem with my mother, who I knew would recognize the incident, the moment that the poem discussed. And I read it to her, and her response to me was, word for word, "Oh, George, how could you have written that?" She was upset by my memory of this intense moment for me in my childhood, and for my love for both of my parents, and this very stressful, traumatic moment that I knew I had to share with her. But when she had that response, I knew I was a poet. That I had faced something that was terrible for me, and put it in artistic form as best I could, and that she recognized it, did not accept it per se, but I also knew that that response was a validation.
Hard validation, what a validation, yes. I was listening to the earlier part of what you were talking about, and there was something in the cadences of what you were reading, which you said blues musicians were among your influences, and there was a blues feeling to the rhythms of it, the way that you said, and also, as you said, the raunchiness of some of it comes out there. Yeah, that's fun. And I mean, there's a lot that I would like to ask. I'm also conscious of the time, and I want to make space and time for the audience as well. But so I'll just confine myself to a few things. What does a poet laureate do?
I've been a poet laureate twice, for the city of Toronto and then for the Parliament, or basically the nation of Canada. In both situations, the bureaucrats responsible for handling the programs basically said it was up to me to make of those positions what I wished. And so what I tried to do, and so everybody, in other words, everybody's different. Everybody approaches the poet laureateships differently. But in my case, I decided at the city level that I was going to try to make it an important institution, so that it would be understood that the poet laureate always addresses city council at least once a year. And that whenever anything really important happens for the city, politically, culturally, economically, that the poet laureate is going to be asked immediately, would you feel inspired to write something about this? And of course, to do the outreach to youth, and to visit the libraries and to help other people get published and establishing lists of poets. I put together a map of Toronto poets for the city libraries, for instance. At the national level, I made it my mission to visit every single province and territory of what is the world's second largest country after Russia. Canada is the second largest country in the world. So I made it my purpose, and I was the first, and I think maybe still the only poet laureate nationally to actually visit every single province and all the 3 northern territories. And so I had a chance to see the Arctic Ocean. You know, wow, a lot of ice. But I valued very much meeting my fellow and sister Canadians all over the country and encouraging folks to write poetry. And then I also posted poetry on the Parliamentary website to do my own little sort of anthology of Canadian poets of all sorts, all kinds of different backgrounds and styles of poetry. But I wanted to try to give them a voice. And the last thing I did was I convinced the Parliamentary Library that they should have a poet's corner. So they created one. So institutionalizing things once again.
This is going to be erratic because I'm trying to fit in lots of things. So I'm not going to segue smoothly from one thing to the other as we would if we were chatting with an unlimited amount of time before us. But we have a lot of young students joining us from another university. So could you spend a little time on your poetic practice? How do you approach your poem? Also something that you said when we were talking about the Poet Laureateship, which is that at times you are expected to write something about something that had happened. So the thing of writing on demand, perhaps. But yes, how you approach a poem, the way, you know, there are poets who will write it at one shot, put it away, and that's it. There are others who keep coming back and constantly revise their work. There are poets who write for the page, others who write to perform, to speak it aloud. And who may have strong opinions. There are poets who write on the page who don't believe in performance. There are, you know, and who would say read poetry in monotone. Who clearly are not one of those. And, you know, on things like rhyme, things like that, what words would you offer, therefore? So if you could go a little into your practice and then tell our young people here a little about how perhaps you would suggest that they journey into poetry.
That's a great question. Once again, Peter, marvelous question. And I have to come at it again with the notion of that there's something for everyone in poetry, potentially. There's something for everyone. And therefore, every style and every approach has its strengths. And it's really up to the individual poet to determine how he, she, they are going to approach that palace. What path and what maybe series of connected paths are they going to take to get there? And so I am not in favor of saying you can only write for the page, you can only write for the stage, you can only write in rhyme, you can only write free verse. I believe, you know, I will say that one of my great influences was the late, very great Derek Walcott. And one of the reasons why I liked Walcott so much as a poet and like Walcott so much as a poet is because he did not discriminate. He did everything. He wrote free verse. He wrote metered verse. He tried, I think, every single form of poetry imaginable. He did verse drama. He did epic poetry. He did, of course, the lyric poems. He also did poems in patois, in slang, in his own tongue, his own native tongue, and I think set a great example for all poets in English that we do not have to be restricted in any way. So for me, to get to the point about practice, I guess there are basically two major categories for me of writing. The first category is, and in fact, I have to be honest and say the one that I tend to use the most is simply to say, I want to write something about something. And then I keep a journal, like many poets, many writers do. I keep a journal, and I enter into that journal images and ideas and lines, phrases, and overheard bits of conversation and so on. And I write it all down. I don't know what I'm going to use any of it for when I'm taking these lines, these notes, but I just have them there. But when I'm ready to think about writing, I go back to my journal, I open it up, and I think to myself, I'm going to write a poem about, well, passages to India. And I look at my journal and I see a bunch of phrases that all of a sudden I can see that they could fit in a poem of that sort. And I start to assemble the poem based on this accidental arrangement of lines and images that I know suddenly would fit that particular kind of poem. And so the vast majority of poetry that I write comes out of looking at the lines and phrases and ideas and images I've collected in my journal and letting my mind wander a little bit amongst the phrases and sentences and lines and images until I find the assortment I think I can use. And then magically, the poem begins to appear. And then there's the other major way for me to write a poem, and that is sheer inspiration. I just simply feel inspired. But I also admit that that's the minority. That's the minority case, where I feel inspired by strong emotion to sit down and write something out of my heart and my head without looking at anything else, just direct inspiration from within. And I honor and cherish those moments. I do. I honor and cherish them because for me, they are not every day. The poems that I tend to write are those that I put together. When I was a teenager, and I'll say this for anyone else who might face a similar criticism, I had an English teacher tell me that I wrote poetry as if I were a construction worker. And he meant it as a criticism, like that's a negative. You shouldn't be writing poetry like you're a construction worker. But now, hey, today's International Labor Day. Today is May Day. So let's celebrate labor. So I'm going to say that it's definitely okay to write poetry like you're a construction worker. It's okay, folks. It's all right. Every path is okay. Every path is open to us to pursue as we make our way towards that great palace on a hill up there that we can see. We're going to get there. Every possibility is open to us.
I suspect I know the answer to this one that I'm going now, considering what you've said so far about language and about freeing oneself. But what are your thoughts on poetic form?
I love it. I love it. I think poetic form is great. I often write sonnets. I often write quatrains, couplets, haiku, blank verse. I love blank verse. Blank verse is great. I fell in, one of my great influences in my early 20s was John Milton, the radical, revolutionary, Puritan, and puritanical dude, assassin of kings. I shouldn't say stuff like that, but that is Milton. To be Miltonic is say I'm okay with killing the king. All right. But I love blank verse. Paradise Lost. Oh my golly. I used to walk around with a huge volume of Paradise Lost under my arm and just read it and read it and read it. And I kept trying to write blank verse all the time for like 2 years. I was writing nothing but blank verse. And so I believe that form helps imagination. Form helps you find the diction and the rhythm for the work. And that's important because in the old days, and still even today, if you're a performance poet, if you're somebody who likes to to recite the poem, deliver the poem from a stage of whatever sort, you need to have either you have the phone in your hand and the screen and you're reading from the phone, or you have it memorized. And that's the old school. The old school was you memorize things, right? And so that's the importance of rhyme and meter. Rhyme and meter lets you memorize much more easily than free verse. You can memorize things, and then you own the poem. You know, a lot of people, because of course, the 1960s, I'm a child of the 1960s, and of course, the pedagogy in those days was it's bad to force students to learn by rote. It's bad to force students to memorize. There's something dictatorial and tyrannical about memorization. And so we moved away from that model, at least in Canadian schools in the 1960s. And I think that was a disservice to our young selves and our young minds, because what we didn't understand and what the school system itself did not understand or appreciate enough is that when you memorize a poem, you own it, no matter who wrote it, no matter who wrote it. When you memorize a poem, you now own it. It is in you. It's in your brain. It's in your blood. It's in your pulse. It's in your breath. And you control that poem. You control that poem. Doesn't matter who wrote it. You control it. When you have that poem mastered, memorized, it's yours. You can read it fast. You can read it slow. You emphasize this line. You don't emphasize that line. You control it like an actor controls the speech on stage or in a film or what have you. So that's the greatness of form, is that it assists in the mnemonics, the memorization, and therefore the performance. You don't know when you're going to need a poem. It's like scripture. If you memorize scripture, the importance of memorizing scripture is that you have it for those moments when you need it: consolation, empowerment, strength, and so on. So politically too, if you memorize King, I Have a Dream, right? You can use that speech in all kinds of different contexts to make yourself feel better, stronger, more empowered, and to bring others along. This is, I often mention to students that if we fell back into medieval England with all of its terrors and evils and horrors and whatnot, and we were studying poetry, we would actually be studying rhetoric. That's what Shakespeare learned. Shakespeare didn't learn poetry, he learned rhetoric. He learned the techniques of rhetoric. And so that's why there's this strong connection between poetry, oratory, the sermon, rhetoric, political speech, and so on. They're all interconnected. And memorization helps. When a politician gets up in front of an audience and is able to emote and use memorization as well to produce a speech on a particular topic to try to persuade an audience, he, she, they is likely to be far more effective than someone who's stumbling around looking at the notes or trying to, where's my speech? Where's the speech so-and-so wrote for me? It just doesn't work as well as someone being able to confidently deliver a program, an idea in memorized form, and maybe even in verse form with a band in the background, backing up.
Poetry, after all, poetry, ballads, songs, this is the way, these predate writing, these predate literacy. People told stories, they rhymed them, they sang them, they passed the lore on verbally. And for so many of us, that's, as you say, it's a disservice to no longer memorize. You don't have to memorize poems, perhaps. And even more so when you see poets who don't memorize their own work and read it off a page, for instance, that can sometimes feel strange. And I will say right away, guilty here. Let me take a few audience questions. There's one that works right away for what we were just discussing from your fellow Canadian, Aisha. Aisha says, you have a very distinct performance style. I've heard it compared to hip hop. Did you always perform your work that way, or has it developed this way over the years?
Aisha's question is so great, and I will say that I came to it. I evolved into my particular style, and I was forced to, because when I started as a poet, I published my first book when I was 23 in 1983. I was very much in the mode of, I'm gonna talk about her again. I was very much influenced by Margaret Atwood, who is famous for a very dry and monotone delivery of her work, which works well for her. But when I started as a poet, I thought I had to recite poetry just like Margaret Atwood does. And so that's how I would recite things, very, dry and curt and plain. No inflection in the voice, just even tones. And again, that has worked really well for her. But I'm from a Black community. And when I got up in front of my Black community in Nova Scotia, 1986, I'll never forget it. I was the token poet on the program. Everybody else was a musician, an actor, a dancer, a singer, and so on. And then there was me, the poet. So the dancers, the actors, the singers, the musicians, they got lots of love. The audience was like, yeah, great. And then it's my turn. I'm a published poet. I got a book. And I get up there and I start to recite. Well, this is a Black audience. People are yelling at me, get off the stage. They're telling me, get off stage. Why don't you go home? When are you gonna finish? Because I was bombing bad. I was like just going down bad. But luckily I had just written a piece that wasn't in my book. I just written it. And it's called Love Letter for an African Woman. So I put down the book, put the book away, picked up this piece that was still in manuscript and began to recite that, read that to the audience. Now, everybody in the audience was in love with that poem. Everybody was, because I'm talking about their mom, I'm talking about their girlfriend, I'm talking about their sister, I'm talking about their aunt, I'm talking about grandma. Love Letter to an African Woman. Well, look, the audience now started to cheer. They started to say, okay, wow, that's all right, you're home now, okay, right? And so when I finished that poem, lots of love from the audience. And at that point, I said, thank you very much, and left the stage, because I didn't have anything else to read. That I knew they were going to like, and there's nothing else. So after that moment, I said, I will never appear in front of a Black audience ever again without having something I can read that they're going to like. And I have stuck to that. And that helped me evolve my style.
Right. Question from Anushya Ramaswamy. And I'm going to combine a bit of her question with and add on a bit of mine. Her question is, how do these Black narratives get received with white audiences, especially in the classroom? I'm going to combine this with, when you said you were looking at influences, a lot of your influences, the Black influences in your life were from south of the border. Did you how did you find community, poetic community, where you were in Canada? There are people here who are watching. Menka Shivdasani, fellow resident of Bombay, is here. And Menka is one of the first people that gave me a sense of being in a community, the sense of acceptance. Menka built a poetry community over decades called Poetry Circle, for instance, in Bombay, which a lot of the best loved poets in the city right now read in that room. What was your community? And where did that come from for you?
Wow, another great question. And, you know, I'm reminded of Dylan Thomas's poem, In My Craft or Sullen Art. And the reason why that title comes to mind is because as I begin to answer this question, I need to acknowledge our loneliness. I need to acknowledge our solitude. I need to acknowledge how solitary we often are when we sit to write or stand to write or whatever. We are coming from a place very much isolated and self-isolated and alone and lonely in comparison to others. No matter how close you may be to lovers or spouses or parents and siblings and so on, and friends. The act of writing poetry, I think especially, is a lonesome act. And so you begin in this isolated moment, So then how do you form a community with other like-minded, isolated people? I suppose in some ways now with the internet, it's a little bit easier, but I have to say that I did feel very much alone as a poet in my community as a teenager and as a university student. I also felt very much alone. I did find communion with some other student poets at the university that I attended, University of Waterloo, and we were very much together against the world. We were all misfits who didn't belong anywhere except with each other. And I was the only Black member of our group, but there were different ethnicities amongst us. And we were brought together because no one else was going to really could we depend upon to give us editing advice, to be a guaranteed audience as we try to recite or publish our work and so on. So we found community by being forced to stand together. The university I attended was very technocratic, oriented towards the sciences and engineering, mathematics, computer science. And so the entire arts contingent was considered basically a lot of hippy dippy types who didn't contribute anything to the world, the poets being the number one offenders in this sense. What did we have to offer anybody except a bunch of words? So we were like persona non grata, all of us on campus. So we did gravitate towards each other. And so that was one way in which I had a kind of community starting out. But then I also needed to have a community of other poets of color and Black poets and minority poets and so on. And I eventually ended up finding a group of folks who were like me, trying to find our voice, trying to get published in a publishing situation where folks with unusual surnames or who had an accent, supposedly, in answering a phone or appearing on stage would not be as readily published. Or if we chose to talk about race, racism, sexism, homophobia, and other isms, we could also be barred from publication or barred from the stage and not invited to do this and not invited to do that, and certainly not to be shortlisted for any prizes or to be given any kind of attention. So we then had to, I think, I'm not trying to speak for everybody, but I think we then had to take solace. We had to take some solace in the history of the art and the history of activism, which unfortunately, or maybe we could say fortunately, is a history of folks endeavoring to write and to speak and to act, even when there didn't seem to be any audience interested in what we had to say and no public interested in our politics in terms of trying to move things forward. But in the end, keeping in mind that it's always an isolated, solitary kind of work anyway, the duty is to do it. The duty is to write. The duty is to try to get the work out there by any means necessary, to quote Malcolm X, by any means necessary, get the work out there. And by doing that, you will find your community and you will find your proteges and you will find your mentors and you will find the ways to help each other. Still answering your question now, but I'll just come directly to the present. I'm 61. I have fewer years ahead of me than I have behind me. And I realize more and more that my duty now is to help others as much as I can. Younger, not necessarily, to get their work out there, to be heard, to be sung, to be published, to be critiqued, to be taught, to list somebody's book on my syllabus. And then to invite them to a university classroom. So they have that experience of being questioned by students and can find some enhancement of their own status as poets, to be taken seriously by a university classroom. That's amazing. That's amazing. You're a poet and you step in front of a university classroom and you've got students who are asking you questions. Wow. that says you're a poet. Right there, you're a poet instantly. Right, I'm a poet. Okay, next question. You know, that kind of thing. So I try to give that experience to other poets too, and I try to get others translated and published. One of the things I've started to do with my own poetry is to deliberately invite poets from other languages into my text, into my work, by asking them to translate something by me. And so then I include my poem, of course, but I also include their translation, because I want to have that community, you know, across the languages, and I also like to see my words appear differently, to look different. You know, I have my words in Hindi, have my words in Arabic, have my words in Chinese, in Korean. Wow. You know, they have a poem in Italian, they have a poem in Finnish, in Spanish. Wow. You know, and at the same time, I'm also building bridges, you know, with poets from other nations, other languages. And it's a two-way street, in terms of giving them a little bit more exposure in Canada and in Canadian English, and they giving me a little bit more exposure in Chinese or in some other tongue. And then there's an exchange that takes place. And eventually, yes, I want to go to China. I want to go to India. I want to go to Japan. I want to go to Israel. I want to go back to Africa. I want to see more of the world. If God spares me, I want to see more, and hear more, understand more, and do more music.
You know, problem with a formal conversation, which is part of an event, is that there is a limited amount of time. And I really want to take this conversation on, and perhaps we will find a way to do this. But we are already over time, and I do want to make time for you to do one more poem for us, perhaps.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So I'd like to end with your voice. So let me quickly, before I bring you on, also say my thank yous to everyone in the audience who came in today. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for making time on a Saturday evening. Thank you to Prakriti Foundation for this festival, which brings us poetry every weekend. And perhaps there's no better time for poetry than the kind of world that we're living in now. And thank you, George Elliott Clarke, for making the time to talk to us from halfway across the world on the other side of it. We do hope that you will join us in, the festival live one day. Ranveer, who is the founder of Prakriti Foundation, the trustee, is also with us. So I'm not sure if Ranveer wants to turn his camera on, but on his behalf as well, thank you. And on his behalf, I'm sort of, without consulting him about the budgets, I'm inviting you to the next Poetry with Prakriti that we have in Chennai. But
yay!
So I would like to end this evening, George, which has been fabulous. Thank you very much. I would like to end this evening with another poem from you, please.
Well, I want to say very quickly, again, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Professor Archana. Thank you, Mr. Subramanian, for the technical expertise. Thank you, Mira, as well, and the Prakriti Foundation for putting all this together. It's been, as I said already, memorable for me. A profound thank you again, and a profound honor to be able to share my work with you and my ideas. So I'm going to close with, I hope, what will be an upbeat kind of poem, and a poem that's about orality and language and speaking and singing. And it's a Haligonian market cry. The city I'm from in Nova Scotia is Halifax, and there's a Halifax in England too. but I think the people in Halifax, England are called Halifaxers, which makes sense. They should be called Halifaxers. But the people of Halifax, Nova Scotia, no one knows why, we're called Haligonians. I think it has maybe something to do with going to hell. Oh, but anyway, so Haligonian. So Haligonian market cry. And this is my idea of the Halifax marketplace. And a guy trying to sell his fruit and vegetables. And so he says, I got hallelujah watermelons, virginal pears, virtuous corn, minute heg et altera winkit, luscious fat ass watermelons, plump pears, big butt corn, Lagusta estahardine, come and get a cucumbers, hot to trot lust, fresh cucumbers, voulez-vous coucher avec moi? Watermelons, go to church and get redeemed, watermelons, unbatio, ancora, good God, cucumbers, righteous pears, golden Baptist corn, lieben wir alle nicht des Sinnes loosed, I got sluttish watermelons, sinful cucumbers, jailbait pears, planted by Big Mouth Chaucer and picked by Sugar Shakespeare.
Hallelujah, hallelujah.
Thanks, Peter.
All right, and yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm just going to ask Amira, Harish still there, and Ranveer if they could briefly turn on the cameras so we could take a screenshot. And Professor Archana as well. Professor, I'm sorry that I wasn't able to get to your question, but we were running out of time. Yeah, so just give me a second while I get the print screen button ready. Can I have your best smiles, please? Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you. Truly appreciate it. Bye. Until next time.